Hello and welcome to another edition of the GNet TV News Project In Depth. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet TV. It's my pleasure to be with you today and glad you're joining us. Also glad to have with us here in the studio the 4 area representatives from our district. We're going to introduce them to you in a moment. When we invited our panel here today a couple of weeks ago for the show, the idea was it would be sort of a wrap-up discussion about what happened up in Montpelier during the past session. But as we all know, the session isn't quite over yet. We're going to be seeing our lawmakers go back up north for a 2-day session, possibly a 3-day session later in June, and to resolve some lingering issues around the budget and state teachers contract issues, as well as perhaps a few other things they may be getting involved with at the time. So I guess it's a case of to be continued, but a great moment to find out a little bit about what happened up in Montpelier over the last 4 months or so, and to hear their thoughts on some of the major bills that they dealt with while they were there. So by way of introduction, although I think for many of you this is hardly necessary, start over with Brian Keefe, who is the representative from Manchester, Arlington, Sunderland, and Sandgate. He won election to that 2-member district last November. Next is Linda Joy Sullivan, who represents Dorset, Danby, Mount Tabor, Peru, and Landgrove. She also won election for the first time last November as well. Then we have Cynthia Browning, who is the other member of the 2-member district, although Cynthia was the more senior of the two, having won election for the first time in 2007. She represents Arlington, Manchester, Sunderland, and Sandgate as well. And last but hardly least, we have with us Oliver Olson, who represents Jamaica, Winhall, Londonderry, Weston, and Stratton. For some reason, I always have trouble getting those 5 towns out. Anyway, great to have you all with us today, and certainly lots to talk about. And let's jump right into the big question, I guess, or the sort of a twin big questions, the state budget and the issue around the state teachers' health insurance contract. There are 2 separate bills, but kind of tied together. Governor Scott, at the end of the session, was unable to come to yes with the leadership of the State House around a roughly $5.75 billion state budget, even though that budget gave him a lot of what he was looking for back in January because of some concerns about how I guess you could call it a windfall of roughly $75 million might be allocated, and $26 million of that he was hoping to put towards property tax relief. I guess, Cynthia, let me look to you first to get us started here. What is the relationship between these 2 issues, and how did they lead us to the fact that you're all going to be going back to Montpelier in a couple of weeks to finish your work?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, I just want to say in terms of the budget, I think the legislature deserves a lot of credit for taking Governor Scott at his word that he wanted no new taxes, no new fees. He wanted not to raise taxes on Vermonters, and they really didn't. And they budgeted within the amount of money that they had. That's one of the first times they've really done this in quite a while. It's the first time in like 7 years that I voted for the budget because they really did hold the line. So in that sense, in terms of the budget itself, they really did what the governor was looking for. But there's this separate issue of the teachers' health insurance, which is involved in what's called the yield bill, which is really setting property taxes. So at the beginning of the session, the governor put out a variety of proposals about freezing school budgets or mandating certain varieties of teachers' health insurance, and they went nowhere in the legislature. Then towards the end of the session, he came out with this new proposal with the School Board Association to basically mandate 80-20 relationship of employer-employee paid for all teachers. And he said that in order to get that, he wanted to have the state negotiate health insurance for the teachers instead of the districts. And it was all in the name of saving money and putting money back towards the property taxpayers, lowering tax rates. But it also became a real political football and a tug of war about collective bargaining and politics and all that kind of stuff. So because that was not resolved in a way that he liked, he says he's going to veto the budget, even though it's a separate bill, and veto the yield bill. So it's really all revolving around the property tax bill. Even though we are not raising property taxes here, this is about how do we gather the savings from the change in teachers' health insurance going forward. So right now, probably in Montpelier, right this minute, people are trying to work out a deal because they're not going to be able to override his veto. Does that cover something?
Well, let me ask the rest of you, what do you all think of this issue? It certainly seemed to occupy most of the oxygen in the room last couple of weeks of the session.
It certainly did, Andrew. And I think, just to echo Cynthia's comments and amplify them a little bit.
Sure.
One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that this is truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because of some dynamics at play with the Affordable Health Care Act and the Cadillac tax that's associated with that federal piece of legislation. All healthcare contracts are coming up for renewal this summer, so it's sort of like the sun, the moon, the stars are all in perfect alignment to really start thinking about how we could take a holistic approach to handling the negotiations for teacher health care. So what the governor has proposed is not just short-term savings this year, but actually putting a structure in place to ensure sustainable long-term savings. And I think that's a point that has been missed in a lot of the conversation. People are comparing various proposals or counter-proposals that have been offered, that offer the promise of delivering some short-term savings, but in my opinion, don't live up to the promise of actually delivering a more sustainable structure for containing healthcare costs in the long term.
Sure, thank you. Following up with both Representative Olson and Representative Browning, I want to say that the governor and the House and the Senate all have tried to negotiate. I think they all have Vermonters' best interests at heart, but they have a task that is going to be a tough one. I was curious to know where the Secretary of Education actually took her position, because I was curious to say, why didn't she come out to the microphone? Why didn't she step up and say, here are my thoughts? And the administration informed me that she didn't come out to the microphone. However, she did participate in the proposals that went back and forth with the negotiation. So that told me that they really were serious about trying to solve the issues, but transparency is very important. And I think that the veto, to me, is what puts me in a position that says we need to be responsible, because vetoing a budget and a tax bill is a serious position. It stops us from cutting checks and paying what we need to do, and that could really harm Vermonters. So my hope, and from my discussions with administration, is that they will all come to some realization that we have to work it out and not make the veto actually happen. And I truly believe that they will be able to do this. I think they're all smart enough, keen enough, and want to protect Vermont.
So I'll just add that I think the four of us are in agreement that the biggest success of the session was probably the balanced budget without raising taxes and fees, and yet it remains the biggest puzzle because we still haven't quite gotten through there for reasons that I won't repeat. But I think Oliver's point was especially valid, that these are an opportunity for long-term sustained savings. So I give a lot of credit to the governor for setting that leadership right up front, that he wanted to do this without raising taxes. And I give credit to the Democratic leadership in the House, the Speaker, and Kitty Toll, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, because it took a lot of work to get to that point. So we were actually able to increase funding for early education, early childhood education, and increase funding for the state college systems and still stay within that template of no taxes, no new fees. So, but we're still not out of the woods yet, and maybe it can be solved without the veto, but I think the governor wants to maintain that negotiating leverage, and the talks are going on as we speak.
Well, from the outside of Montpelier, it sure seemed like the two positions were kind of far apart by the time you ended things there a couple of weeks ago. What is the middle ground on this question? Because it seems like the NEA, the State Teachers Union, has really dug in on this whole issue of collective bargaining. That they want to be able to do it the way it's been done in the past, school board by school board, as opposed to at a state level. If there's no give on that, how do we find a compromise ground between, getting the budget voted through as it's basically structured at the moment, and finding agreement on the teacher's contract?
I think that one of the things that's interesting is to look at the last couple of proposals that were going back and forth, because one of them essentially tried to recreate the opportunity by saying, okay, we're going to do everything the way we usually do now, but then everybody's contract for health insurance will expire in 2 years. And we're going to look at this question of where should it be negotiated, how should it be. So in other words, they were going to try to create this opportunity again in 2 years. And then there was another version that came close to mandating the 80-20 kind of split. So I think that's where the middle ground is. I think that the teachers union should be careful about how they're operating on this, because it's important to note that since 1947, the teachers union has been negotiating teachers' retirement directly with the state rather than districts, school boards. So it's not like it's unprecedented for such an arrangement to occur. I also think it's interesting that I've seen local reports about teachers, I think in one of the Rutland districts, threatening to go on strike because all they were getting was 4.5% a year, and I don't know anybody who's getting 4.5% wage increase a year. So I think that teachers may be overplaying their hand, and I'd like them to realize that continued support for education and for their budgets that have their compensation, they need to be aware that Vermonters are paying their salaries and they can't get too far out ahead of it. I'd actually like to see some kind of caps put in place on education spending, maybe some version of what was originally in Act 46, so that school boards had to budget to a cap. And if they want to give increases in compensation, okay, but they're going to have to stay under the cap. Because one of the things about the proposals we've been talking about, you could save money on the health insurance and then give it back in the salaries. So nobody's proposal has dealt with that. And I think some kind of cap, which Representative Olson was involved in developing for Act 46, something like that I see as necessary. That's not what's in the proposals before us, but I just wanted to put that out, that this has become so political that nobody's actually acknowledging that just controlling health insurance, although that's very important, doesn't actually control budgets.
Well, it sets the stage, I'm sure, for a fascinating couple of days in Montpelier. And a couple of other things to talk about that 3-day session. But while we're on the subject of education, Oliver, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the independent school, Rule 2200, I believe. Last December, this was a very hot, controversial subject down here where the State Board of Education was considering changing the rules around independent schools and their ability to access state funding. Where are we at this point? That kind of at least seemed to kind of get a little bit muted towards in the last couple of weeks, but maybe not so much from your standpoint.
It's certainly not muted. The issue is very much alive, and it was something that has, as you know, has consumed much of my time and effort over the past year, actually now that I think about it. And the threat remains, it's very real. There is a very concerted effort to curtail or even potentially eliminate school choice in Vermont. And the vehicle, there have been many attempts through various vehicles over the years, but the latest vehicle is, or avenue has been through the State Board of Education with this Rule Series 2200. As you know, this really came to a head with a series of public hearings, both here in Manchester as well as up in St. Johnsbury. That really forced the legislature to stand up and take note. Our Bennington County Senate delegation, Senator Sears and Senator Campion, really took the lead on this in the Senate. Unfortunately, the dynamics of the House are such that we simply don't have the strength in numbers and support from a leadership perspective to tackle this very directly in the House. So a lot of the action has actually been in the Senate, where there's a much greater concern over the actions that the State Board of Education attempted to take last year. So the long and short of it is that the Senate Education Committee spent a great deal of time over the winter and well into the spring looking at this issue, hearing from all sides, And they pushed for, and they were successful in their negotiations with their counterparts in the House in basically securing, as part of H513, which was just recently signed into law, an omnibus education bill, a provision in law that actually directs the State Board of Education to cease and desist from taking any further action on Rule 2200 until next year, or the very end of this year. And in replacement, they've set up a study committee that actually includes balanced representation from both sides, which was sorely missing in the process last year, that will look at these issues and come back with recommendations at the end of the year. And then at that point, the State Board of Education can hopefully take a more reasoned approach. But if they don't, we'll be right back in the middle of the legislative session, and we'll have an opportunity to address the matter again, if necessary, through legislative means.
The other question that may be on your plates when you're up there is this marijuana bill. The governor vetoed that legislation right at the very end. It would have legalized possession of 1 ounce of marijuana and given people the ability to grow, I think, 2 mature or 4 immature plants, one thing or another. It would have been the first bill that would have legalized marijuana by a vote of the legislature as opposed to a vote of referendum. Is that going to come up again? The governor, as I understood him, when he vetoed the legislation, said he was open to compromise and revising it, and was concerned about the driving restrictions and also about the composition of this commission that would be setting up a tax and regulate structure that would report back sometime later this year, and then this bill would come into force July of 2018. So, Linda, let me turn to you. Where does this all stand at the moment? Is this going to be turn your 2-day session to a 3-day one? Because I gather, in order to have this discussion, the Republican leadership would have to agree to vote to suspend the rules.
Right. I know that. They have to suspend the rules whether they will or not. It's going to be up to them. And
So
of
look
course,
to
we'll
your counterpart here to
Brian
chime in
say
on
yay
this
or
one.
nay. But pretty much on the marijuana bill itself, I don't think that the governor is too far apart from his ask with the bill as it's out there. I think that safety, of course, is an issue for everybody. It's very difficult to come up with what's safe and what's not safe for our children. Some people have actually touched it, and some people are being more philosophical. So I think that the negotiations going on right now will continue to see if actually the governor and the House can get closer together. I think that as far as the regulation side with businesses, that's going to be a bigger picture. I think that's an entirely different bill or an adjustment to the bill. So if the bill actually ends up coming back next year, that would be something to look at. But I think if they want to resolve the issue, they can do it right now. I think that Vermont has taken a big step, not such a baby step, and said, hey, we are going to step in and regulate. From my own personal experience working in the fields with victims and children, I think it's important that we stop the trafficking. And the only way to do that is to get on the radar and say we are going to be there. So hopefully they will come up with a solution. I don't think it will take us 5 or 6 more days of June, but I do think that they're close. I can't see them not being that close in the regulation.
Brian, what do you think is the sense within the Republican caucus on this bill? My takeaway is that Don Turner and your other counterparts were somewhat unenthusiastic about it, and ironically, this bill might never really come up before the legislature had not the budget impasse kind of dragged things out a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. If we had adjourned on schedule, the clock would have run out on the marijuana bill, and as it was, we stayed around 2 more weeks, and this bill came out. I was assigned to the Human Services Committee, and we took a lot of testimony on the marijuana bill, and it's clear, there's a lot of valid concerns as far as enforcement and education, and just the fact that things are moving fast in other states. Some see that as an argument in favor of Vermont moving fast, others, and I agree with this, maybe we give it a little bit more time to see how it evolves in the other states. Whether or not we can have time to deal with this if there is a veto session. I'm not sure, but I'll say it's not just Republicans that are resistant to this. There were a pretty fair number of Democrats. So in order to suspend the rules, you need 50 or 51, I guess. And the numbers right now just aren't there if the bill does come back up next session or during the veto session. So we'll see. The negotiations are underway. And on the one hand, it's hard to say, well, you grow a couple plants, what's the big deal? Massachusetts is going to be legal to buy it there soon. But a lot of people are growing pot now, and a lot of people can go to Massachusetts. So we'll see how it rolls out.
One of the things that I found kind of odd about it is that apparently you can possess an ounce, but if you're unlucky enough to be observed by a law enforcement officer obtaining it, that could be a problem. Would that be an accurate characterization
That is
of it?
still true. You can grow your own. What was put in place in the bill that would go into effect a year from now is that you could grow your own and keep what you harvest, but you can't buy it. So that's why this is supposed to be this Vermont approach of you can grow your own, but it's still illegal to be a dealer. And then there's this commission to study having businesses growing and selling and retail, and that's the next step.
I think it's this particular bill is a good case study in why we should be thankful that we don't have a referendum system, because these issues are really complex, and I say that as somebody who voted for the bill. So these issues are complex, and I can see both sides. And there's a big discussion over do we want to take more of the Vermont sort of laid back, keep it in your house approach versus, more of a commercial model like they have in Colorado. And those are really difficult conversations, and and they're questions that come out of those conversations that are simply can't be answered in a yes or no ballot initiative. So I'm it's times like this and this particular example where I'm really glad that we're able to have this conversation in a rational manner, without a lot of advertisements saying vote yes, vote no.
I wanted to also give you all an opportunity to talk about some of the other bills that you were working on since last January that maybe didn't get as much ink or headlines or megabytes, I guess would be the more appropriate way of putting it now. Linda, there was a bill on ethics that you were interested in. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and kind of where is that at the moment?
Sure. Vermont actually is one of the few states that doesn't have an ethics bill, and we've actually come out with a huge ethics bill. There was a lot of controversy there, even going to the point of defining the partners and who would have to disclose and transparency. And it went back and forth. I know I had brought up several questions during the discussions to the committees. I was concerned about certain professional rights to keep their clients privileged, because you can't just disclose every single person. There are conflicting laws in Vermont that would conflict with what the ethics bill started out as. So they discussed that, and there was a lot of changes that went on so that you don't have to disclose your clients, you just have to disclose your firm name, the source, certain dollar amounts that were there. I did find some humor in, as I did identify to my representative Browning next to me, in the domestic partner definition, there is one line that says that if your partner is a partner of somebody else, they don't have to disclose. And so I thought that was quite fun. Yep. But so I guess we all know what to do now. However, I do think that it's time that we have an ethics bill. I think that they worked hard on it. I think that it was pretty unanimous, I believe, on the vote. I don't think there was anyone who voted against it, maybe one person or so. But I think the majority voted for it, and I think it's timely, and I think it's important.
And I just want to follow up on that this bill is certainly not perfect, but it requires statewide candidates to disclose their sources of income and their husband or wife's source of income. And it closes the revolving door. You know, people hear about this revolving door in Washington or in Montpelier where people work for a corporation and then work for the administration and then go back and work for the same corporation or another corporation they were regulating. Legislators do that. You could be chair of a committee regulating an industry and then you go work for that industry. That's not right. Vermonters should be sure that the people they elect are working for them and not looking for where their next paycheck is coming and not abusing the trust that's put in them. So to me, the disclosure is really important for the ethics bill. They deserve to know where we're earning our money, but closing that revolving door is really, really important. And just because Vermont, and we may feel that we're better than other places, doesn't mean that people can't abuse the trust. So I feel as if this is a really important start. It sets up a commission that people can file complaints with. I'm not that impressed with the commission part, but banning the revolving door, saying you can't just go, you have to wait a couple of years before you do that, that's really important to me. So I thought that was a significant accomplishment.
I was surprised that that sort of revolving door syndrome that we've heard a lot about from in Washington, D.C. is so prevalent in Montpelier.
Oh, yeah.
Have there been a lot of cases where people...
People have left the administration, like they're regulating a certain industry, and they leave the administration and they go to work for a company they were regulating. Someone's the chair of a House committee, they resign their seat, and they go to work for one of the corporations they regulated. That's wrong.
Okay. Well, all right, so that problem now we hope is fixed.
No, but at least there's a prohibition on it.
Okay, all right. Brian, let me turn to you next. The benefits cliff bill was one that you worked on. Tell us a little bit about that. That's a case where somebody maybe receiving public assistance gets a pay raise or a boost in income of some sort or another, and then gets disqualified from some of that assistance that may have helped them get that job in the first place. Is that basically what the bill is designed to do? Or at least alleviate the impact of that?
Yeah, so I've heard of this benefit cliff. It's almost like, I wasn't really sure, frankly, what it was all about until I was assigned to the Human Services Committee, and I got an email from a constituent who said she was receiving a modest child care grant, a 10% credit for her child care. And she turned down a pay raise because she would have lost more money than she gained. And she was caught in that, and that's a kind of a common thing. It's gotten better over the years, but there's still some glitches in it, so there was room for improvement. So the bill essentially said if you were offered a raise, you could defer that income into a education savings account for your child or a retirement account for yourself, and it would be disregarded for purposes of calculating your benefit. It's important to know that people that receive these subsidies, they are family people. You have to have a child to get child care benefit. You have to be working. It's temporary by nature. So these are the very people I think that we want to give a hand up to help people grow. Because if you and a lot of them are single moms, and if you turn down a raise or a promotion one year, that gets compounded year after year. Whereas if you're able to continue on that, you can work your way out of it. So that was a thrill actually to see that through our committee and see it through the floor. And I got a lot of support from the people sitting here and others on the bill, and it was great. I was less successful on the check engine light bill, and again, I think I have support. I had a lot of co-sponsors. Went to the floor with an amendment and passed 127 to 11, but then it was dropped in the conference committee. And that would basically allow people to get an inspection sticker even if their engine light's on. It gets complicated after that, but right now you can be denied a sticker if your light's on. Everything else works. It's not a safety issue. And I just thought, we're hitting the wrong people. A lot of people driving around with check engine lights. They don't deserve to be.
Watch out next time you go to inspect. It's like
you can get hit by a $200 or $300 not fine, but cost for sensors or computer glitches, and it just seems too much. So anyway, it passed on the floor. I think everyone here voted for it, and it just got dropped in conference because that's the way things work sometimes. But we'll be back next year.
All right. Well, while we're on the subject of these miscellaneous bills, Oliver, Cynthia, were there some bills that you worked on in your committees that resonated loudly with your constituents in the districts here?
Well, I had actually an interesting one. It actually wasn't it was a bill, but it wasn't a bill I was sponsoring. There was an interesting issue that came up towards the end of the session with where the governor had proposed a merger of the liquor and lottery departments. And, when this came up on the floor, as I was researching this and learning, what was going on, in essence, the governor, through an administrative order, had proposed combining these departments. And the way the law is structured right now, it actually provides the governor the ability to do that, but then it says either branch of either house of the legislature, the House or the Senate, has the power to effectively veto that. And that's exactly what happened in the House. The Senate was fine with the proposal, but the House decided that they didn't like it and they wanted to veto the proposal. And as this was coming up for discussion, I started asking myself some questions like, this is just a really odd structure. And and it didn't seem to comport with constitutional requirements that when the legislature takes some action, it requires the concurrence of both chambers and presentment to the governor for signature. So I actually had our legal staff in the legislature start to look into this question, and it became more complex, and we weren't able to get a definitive answer by the time this came up for discussion, and I raised a point of order on the floor. And anyway, ultimately the so-called veto went through, and there was and we moved forward, but the issue is still very much alive. So I actually, several weeks before the end of the legislative session, actually put in a request with the Attorney General's office to look at this legal question, and I should be hearing back from them within the next few days with a formal opinion as to the constitutionality of that legislative veto. So that will be pretty interesting to see how that shapes.
We always know we have to pay attention when Oliver calls a point of order, because you never know what he's going to do. I just would like to mention one thing, looking towards the next session. As people may or may not know, I am now on the House Ways and Means Committee, which deals with taxes and fees. And there are a whole bunch of bills on the wall, which is where they literally are stacked up, about tax reform, changing taxes in various ways. And I myself have a tax reform proposal involving the income tax and the property tax. And my understanding from the chair of the committee is that next year she wants to look at a whole bunch of the tax reform proposals that people have offered, including, I hope, mine, but things involving the sales tax, things involving how we tax Social Security benefits, and a whole bunch of issues. I have no idea where that's going to come out. But there are enough proposals there that I think the committee really needs to take a look at how we can renew and reform our tax system and make it work more effectively, make it work better for Vermonters. So since the taxes are part of what, the whole veto fight is about in terms of the yield bill, the property taxes, the cost of education, I think it's worth noting that may be something that for next year Ways and Means is taking up.
Okay. So forgive me if we try to get a little granular here on this. I know before we went on, they were talking about this TIF bill, the tax increment financing thing. That's part of the budget. I think a lot of people don't understand what that's all about. It's about creating a special tax district for communities that want to do some kind of development project of some sort of. Bennington is talking about doing one in your downtown. Why only 2 per county? In the bill, as I understand it, why that limit? Why couldn't any town that wants to do that adopt that? Should they be? Why couldn't they do that?
Well, I think I actually, before Cynthia was on the Ways and Means Committee, I served on there for a few years, and we dealt with this, some of these very questions several years ago. The issue whenever you're dealing with with a TIF district or other similar types of vehicles is effectively it's a tax expenditure. We are foregoing tax revenue with the promise that we're investing in growing the base, and ultimately that's going to pay dividends down the road. But there are concerns that depending on how they're structured, that that the revenue may not materialize, and we are in the meantime foregoing a certain amount of revenue. So that has always been the concern. Cynthia can speak to has been the historical concern. Cynthia can speak to the kind of more recent history, but I suspect that's what sort of led to this compromise.
Yeah, and it's important to note that this is about the education fund and property taxes, which of course are involved in the veto fight. So the question of property taxes, costs in the education fund, lost revenue foregone from the education fund, that can drive up property taxes. So what it is it's when a municipality creates a special district and they borrow money, they issue bonds in order to do infrastructure improvements and other things, along with a much larger development project of some kind, redeveloping buildings or other kinds of things. And the idea is that they will use the extra tax revenue, the property tax revenue from that development, because you have an increase in the grand list value, to repay the bonds. If it wasn't for the special district, any new tax revenue would go to the education fund. So right now, the existing tax increment financing districts cost the education fund about $7 million in foregone revenue. A penny on the homestead property tax rate is about $4 million. So you're already almost at 2 pennies worth of foregone revenue. Some of that you might have had anyway, some of them you might not, but the legislative economist on whose analysis we base everything we do says there's $7 million in foregone revenue. So there are certainly many districts in Vermont, many downtowns that need help, and I believe they should have the state's help to do downtown development. I just don't think the money should be coming from the education fund. I think the state needs to find a way in the capital bill or the budget to help with transportation or water and sewer or other kinds of things, not on the property tax, because we know we're having this discussion about how to control property taxes. So the Senate and the House Economic Development Committee came out with a proposal to have 14 new ones, and ultimately the House said no, 2, and then they ended up with 6. And there is nothing rational about any of those numbers. It is a bargaining, it's a splitting the difference. Okay. So, so it's just a negotiation process. So if you have 6, that, and it can be reevaluated. It's not like that's the end of it. But 6 for now, there's going to be a committee looking at the question of the loss to the education fund and how big is that. 14, if you go to 14 and each of them cost $1.5 million, you're talking about $20 million in the Ed Fund. The Ed Fund is not for economic development, it's for educating our children. So that's the problem if you have too many of them costing too much. So we're going to have a few more, we're going to monitor what's happening. I would prefer that the state do a better job of allocating other funds for the economic development initiatives that our downtowns sorely need.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, may I comment
absolutely,
briefly? I think Cynthia's raised some good, valid points, and maybe we could fund, to the extent there's a funding need for these TIFs, the tax incremental financing, maybe there's a better way to do it. But this is important to downtown Bennington. There's a project under review down there right now with all the major players, I believe, in Bennington in support. And Bennington's important to this county, they're important to this part of the state. And so this is something I think will be good for Bennington. And right now, the TIF districts, as I understand, are mostly up north. And it's once again a case where, they have these tools up in Burlington and St. Albans and Montpelier, and they've done great things for their downtowns. And fair is fair. We need some of these tools down here. So there might be a better way. I don't disagree with Cynthia's concerns, but I think it's important that we have an opportunity to partake in some of these programs the way they have them up north.
Sure.
May I?
Absolutely.
When it comes to bond financing, it's always complex, and when it comes to TIFs, the issue is that it's going to flow down to municipalities who's going to be responsible for the actual debt repayment. Bennington does have in place proposed TIF project, and the municipality will assess it. It's not easy to get them through, so just because they're 6 to 14 to 100 doesn't mean you will get more than one. Right. So I agree with Representative Keefe that Bennington does need this project, and if they are in place and have been working hard, they'll either get approved locally or they won't. I think the key is to watch the exit strategies when they negotiate these TIFs to make sure that whoever's going to be participating in the project from the outside is going to maintain those projects and not disappear.
So, it's interesting. We've been talking about TIFs, which are, many consider to be a pretty vital component of our economic development strategy because they allow for investment in infrastructure that may not otherwise happen. And we're talking about current issues here. But one thing I think, a lot of people lose sight of is that the legislative process is a very slow one. And realizing the benefits of some of the things that we do often takes many years. Brian really had a stellar accomplishment with his benefits cliff bill. It's we're not going to see the immediate impact of that this year. This is something that has the potential to impact literally a generation. It's pretty significant. When we, Andrew, I know you covered the Southern Vermont Economic Development Conference, last year. That is a byproduct, if you will, of some legislation that passed the legislature a few years ago, establishing a Southern Vermont Economic Development Zone. And that has really been a catalyst to bring Windham and Bennington counties together to start looking at a more regional approach, and then using that to try to secure federal funding, which is the path they're going down. But these are things that don't happen overnight. We, as a legislature, we have a very limited set of tools available to us, but given the right turns here and there, we can basically lay the groundwork and for some of these long-term initiatives to take fruit. And it's personally rewarding for, as legislators for us to see these things, even though they take several years to start to blossom.
Well, and as I'm sure you know, Oliver, last week there was a conference at Stratton around this very same subject, following up on some of the work that Wayne Granquist and some of your friends did back in 2015 on that Southern Vermont Economic Zone. And really fascinating discussion around demographic questions and labor force issues that came out of that. It'll be interesting to see where all of that goes, because those are indeed some long-term questions that but will have a big impact, I think, on the economy of the state and kind of quality of life that we like to enjoy. I wanted to get back to a couple of other bills that bubbled up over the course of the session. One of them was one that I remember hearing first about, Linda, at one of your sort of little town meetings. That was about the mental health bill that involved getting some workers' comp coverage for firefighters who had PTSD.
Right.
But that was part of a larger bill with mental health benefits. And I wonder if you could get us up to date on where that stands.
Sure, that actually passed. It was the parity bill for mental health and physical injuries. So for first responders, and it went beyond just firefighters and police officers. It went pretty much to anybody, across the board. And the key was there really parity between a physical injury and a PTSD, traumatic event that happened, a recurrence and a triggering event, and when did it actually happen? Could it be pinpointed? And there was a lot of testimony that went on back and forth. And at the end of the day, medical doctors came out and said, yes, there can be parity. So it actually did get voted on unanimously in the House. Whether or not we're going to know the cost factor, we won't know that for a while. So we're going to have to watch the amount of claims that come through and see who files and pay attention to it. And as Representative Olson said, you have to watch, you have to look, you have to revisit. So you start and you work with the tools you have, and of course everybody is open-hearted to, and we respect and we owe back to our first responders, and we want to help them, but we also need to be prudent.
Well, I know there was some concern about the amount of money that might be involved in this. It could, be
So is it in the
more than could be
Senate?
affordable.
It didn't pass the Senate yet, though, right?
It did.
Yes,
it was
it did.
bundled in with
It was
bundled in with
bundled
something
in
else, and
something.
actually
Yes.
it didn't pass the House unanimously,
No,
because
no.
I was one of a very few who actually voted against it. And it's a hard thing to vote against something like this. But I was actually very involved in this issue. I have a constituent of mine who runs Rescue Inc., which is the nonprofit community ambulance service for Windham County, and he's also very active in the Ambulance Association. Nearly all ambulance services in Vermont are provided by municipalities as an extension of the local fire department, or their regional nonprofits that are supported through appropriations from municipalities and then reimbursements from insurance. And the concern that I heard from several of my local ambulance services, including the ambulance service in my own town in Londonderry, which is a completely all volunteer service, there are a lot of unintended consequences, and there were some things that were still not fully fleshed out in the bill. For example, there are concerns about volunteers who also happen to serve on the board, and all of a sudden now that there are implications around workers' compensation insurance. If you look at the profile of a lot of these emergency responders, they tend to serve in a lot of different agencies. So you could be serving as a paramedic for Rescue Inc. for a few days a week, and maybe you serve as a paramedic or an EMT for a different service a few days a week. You're also a volunteer fireman, and you're in the National Guard. So when you start dealing with a traumatic event that triggers PTSD, it starts getting really tricky. How do you pin that down? And those are some of the questions that raise a lot of concerns within the nonprofit ambulance community in particular about where those costs were going to come from, because these guys already operate on a shoestring budget. So, but again, we're just not, to Linda's point, we're just not going to know for several years to see what the true impact is going to be.
A year or so ago, if we were sitting here, we probably would have been talking about the opioid crisis. We would have been saying, what are we going to do, what are we going to do, what are we going to do? And that may be still the question, but I guess I just wondered, were there any large discussions about any kind of major fundamental changes the state should be making? I noticed an article in Vermont Digger the other day that said the wait list at one of the major hospitals, one up in Burlington, or a clinic up there, had gone down drastically from, I think it was like 300 days to 65. Are we seeing this finally peaking and kind of getting better, or
I think it's too soon to say that. I think the problem is still there. I think in some ways it's getting worse because of the fentanyl, which is so deadly and it can be laced in the heroin. I think what's going on is a system has been developed and put in place, and people are trying to run that system as well as possible. I think the Governor Scott has appointed a new commission or board overviewing it. He has appointed some people to try to coordinate everything, but we still have that problem. We have a problem with babies and children. It feeds into the problem of child abuse and neglect. It feeds into the problem of parents losing custody of their children. We have a huge problem. It's just that we weren't setting up new initiatives. We're just trying as hard as we can to implement those we have. And but it is totally on everybody's radar for you guys on that committee, and I think everybody should be aware of that and try to be sure that anybody that they know that is using prescription drugs or heroin or anything gets help as soon as possible.
I think one and this goes back to sort of the long range approach to planning and trying to solve for these complex problems, is the root cause of the heroin epidemic we're seeing can be traced. It's not marijuana, it's not these alcohol, these other things. It's prescription drugs. That's what started this epidemic. People, very innocently in many cases, they had a broken leg and they ended up on some prescription opioids that were overprescribed, and all of a sudden they start taking a few more and they developed an addiction. And then what we did is, nationally, we've really started to kind of tighten up controls over prescription drugs. So then people were looking for an alternative, and that's what really gave rise to the heroin problem that we're seeing. So I actually give a lot of credit. I don't do this very often, but I do give a lot of credit to former Governor Shumlin, who really put a spotlight on this issue, and particularly on the root cause of this, which has been prescription drug abuse, and particularly the overprescription of opioids, and really made that a focus during his administration. I think a lot of good work has been done there. Mm-hmm. So I think we have we've shut, not completely closed, but we have really tightened the spigot that has led to getting people hooked on opioids in the first place. So I think we still have to deal with this population of people who are really struggling with heroin addiction, but I'm hopeful that we will have slimmed down the number of people who are entering the system.
Yeah.
I think we also, it's very important to take more responsibility for who can actually prescribe. In Vermont, you no longer have to be just an MD to prescribe. There is a host of paraprofessionals who can prescribe. So I think it's very important that we look at that as well. And I think the governor, as Cynthia said, did take the lead on this. He's putting together his commission, and we did tell him that Bennington County needs to be part of it as well. And I'm sure that that will be corrected. But I think that it's very important because prescription issuance is key, and that's really what is running amok and is permeating throughout the state.
I think, as Cynthia and others, and Oliver and Linda Joy have said, I think the structure is there. Governor Scott appointed Jolinda LeClaire to head up this effort, and she and I were colleagues working for Senator Jeffers. I've known her for 25 years. She's highly competent, very organized. And I think the governor is focused on this. So I think I don't think it has peaked. I agree. I think it's still a growing problem. But I hope to see that peak soon and get to some of these root causes, because it's a terrible, terrible problem.
We have a few minutes left, and I guess I just wanted to kind of loop back to where we started our discussion and talk a little bit about what's going to be happening in this 2-day session you're all going to be going up for, I think, June 21st, 22nd. Is it solely going to be about just trying to resolve the state teachers' contract and the budget, or what will be the dynamic? Or will everyone be there and you'll have to make a vote on the budget and the governor will sign it, or not, or we'll have like midnight sessions?
No, the governor is probably going to veto the budget if he carries through on what he said, and the yield bill. So the question is, do the various sides come to some sort of negotiation so when we go back, because I don't believe that the Democratic leadership has the votes to override his veto. So that means if he vetoes the budget and they can't override, there's no budget and there's no yield bill, and we have to have one of both. So the best case scenario, I believe, would be if the parties involved negotiate a settlement, and so when we get back, everybody's willing to suspend rules and just vote. And then we could do it in a day. If they're still wrangling back and forth, then it's going to take more time. If they can't come to an alternative that the Republicans like, it's going to take more time. And the more time it takes, the more people will start bringing up other stuff. The same thing about the marijuana. Do people come to an agreement ahead of time, or are they still wrangling? That's the key thing.
The reality is, in the end game like this, the negotiations are between the governor and the leadership in the House and the Senate.
Yes.
This is, there is no committee process. It's
Right.
strictly a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 type negotiation. So, my hope is, Cynthia says, is that they can work this out over the next few weeks, and then when we get up there on the 21st, that there is some sort of a compromise. So that, as procedurally, the governor will, I would expect, will follow through and veto the bill, and that creates the conditions, to, continue this negotiation, hopefully to its conclusion. And if it's something that everybody agrees to, and the governor and the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem all, lock arms and say, yep, kumbaya, we're ready to go. Hopefully we can suspend rules and get out of there. If that's not the case, we risk, seeing this drag on for potentially another week, which would, be really unfortunate. But then as soon as we start doing that, it opens up, we're all there at that point, and it opens up opportunities to take up other issues. And certainly, the governor has signaled, interest in finding compromise on the marijuana bill. If we're up there for more than a day, I would expect that there'll be some action on that.
No, I was going to say I tend to agree with everything. It's an unknown, and this has been, as I've heard from, the representatives who've been there longer than me, this is a very strange year.
I just wonder, to what extent do any of you feel like the fact that we've had all three of those people in leadership positions, the governor, the president pro tem of the Senate, Tim Ashe,
All
and
new.
Mitzi Johnson, the Speaker of the House, all new in their first year in those positions, how much of a factor do you think was that in the fact that you weren't able to come to a consensus at the end?
And also different parties. I think all new,
Yep.
and the two legislative leaders, Democrat and the Republican governor. So that sets up a dynamic. And my prediction would be they will come to some kind of agreement, and it will be an agreement that's essentially something they could have had 2 weeks ago. But it looks like they're getting more, and it saves everybody's face. That's what I think. Because to do anything else is really, really irresponsible. I mean, they have to figure out a way, even if they just kick the can down the road, say, we'll come back to this, and it looks like, well, we really will come back to it, and so everybody can say, okay, I got something. But this is not to resolve this now is getting really, really irresponsible.
We haven't, Andrew, we haven't seen this power dynamic. So part of it is, yes, some of these folks are new in leadership positions, but none of them are inexperienced. They're
That's
all
right.
very savvy players. I personally have a great deal of respect for all three of them. I think all three of them have really done, I think, a good job this past year, new into their roles. I think what we have is really a very different power dynamic than we've seen in a long time. As Cynthia mentioned, we do have divided government. We have a Republican governor, a Democratic legislature, but even if you look back in the last few years of Governor Douglas's term, he did not have in the legislature, he couldn't rely on the legislature to sustain a veto.
Right, and Scott can.
And Scott
pretty
very
much.
clearly, so the Republicans have more members in the House
Yes.
this year than they did in the last few years of Governor Douglas's term. So
And that changes it.
That changes the
Definitely.
game. So the governor has a lot more leverage. He also, he has a reputation, well-deservedly, I would say, for being somebody who is a consensus builder, who works well and gets along with others. It was during the campaign. It was when in the Republican primary. It was his challenger, actually made that an issue. So he, I think, in his first year, really probably feels a need, to put his stamp on things and to assert his, to assert himself. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here.
All right.
Well, if I could just add to that,
Sure.
one of the reasons I ran was to support Governor Phil Scott, hoping he would win and hoping he would have a stronger hand to negotiate things. And I really think it's been pretty successful, the whole dynamic up there, because this complication came up a little bit late, in fairness. And what we're talking about here is not what taxes are we going to raise and what spending are we going to cut and how are we going to raise fees. We've got a budget that does not rely on new taxes and new fees. We have been able to put new money into priorities that everyone supports. But for the opportunity to even save more money for taxpayers, the so-called $26 million, we would have adjourned a month ago, and it would have been a great, successful session. Next year might be a different story because there's a lot of things still percolating. But this year, I think once the dust clears, and it's a little awkward, maybe partly due to newness, but I think people were really working in the same direction to deliver a budget that taxpayers really want and deserve. And the only thing not the only thing, but the major complicating thing is just an opportunity to perhaps save a little bit more money. So we're not talking about where do we go to get more money.
Right.
It's can we save
Save
more?
more money.
So I
Right.
think it's been
This has been a remarkable win for Governor Scott in his first year. I mean, it's really remarkable to if you look back at the beginning of the session, he put forth a very simple message and objective for the legislature. We need to balance the budget without any new taxes. And we also want to invest in some of these important initiatives. He didn't get all of the initiatives, nobody ever does, but the fact that he was able to convey that message at the very beginning and hold the legislature's feet to the fire, and I give a lot of credit to leadership of the House and the Senate for making that happen. I mean, they're the ones that did a lot of the heavy lifting. He set the goal and the vision, and the money committees in the House and the Senate made it happen. So regardless of how this teacher healthcare issue shakes out, This is a real win for the governor and his vision, which was very clearly articulated at the beginning of the session.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it at that for now, but maybe to be continued in a couple of weeks. Who knows? It'll be interesting to see how your two-day session there works out in June 21st, 22nd. But I
One day, hopefully.
wanted to thank all of you for watching today. This has been the In-Depth on GNet TV, and I want to thank particularly our four guests today, Representatives Brian Keefe, Linda Joy Sullivan, Cynthia Browning, Oliver Olson. It's been a real pleasure having you all here today to talk about these and all the issues that we've been dealing with, and also thank you all for watching as well. And we'll see you the next time.